The clock atop the Cheyenne City Hall struck with dry, hollow thuds that dissolved into the parched heat of the Wyoming plains. Red dust kicked up under every hoofbeat, clinging to the threadbare wool skirts and beat-up leather boots of the crowd swarming the end-of-season cattle market. Clara stood pressed against the side of a grain wagon, her thin hands tightly interlaced. At 25, she should have been the belle of the West, but fate had dealt her a losing hand. 3 years ago, a fire at the Boston Conservatory had turned everything to ash: the ivory piano keys, her bright future as a young professor, and her dreams of motherhood. The jagged scar running from her shoulder down to her waist hadn't just ravaged her body. It had branded her a cursed woman in the eyes of the thump the Bible fanatics in this small town. "Well, looky here, ain't that the schoolmarm with the roasted sole?" A laugh reeking of whiskey rang out. A man named Barney, a cattle driver with a reputation for being a real piece of work, stepped closer with 2 of his lackeys. He flicked his horsewhip against the brim of Clara's hat, tilting it aside and exposing the deep red scar at the hollow of her neck. "Here tell your baron, Clara? What's a woman without seed but dead dirt? Maybe I ought to try plowing the field myself?" The surrounding crowd erupted in laughter. The proper ladies hid behind their fans, whispering about God's judgment on the educated and arrogant. Clara stood frozen, her lips trembling but her gaze fixed straight ahead. She had no tears left to cry, only a humiliation that had hardened into a boulder in her chest. Just then a sharp crack split the air. Not a gunshot, but the heavy thud of a rifle butt slamming against the wooden side of the wagon. "Back off before I turn your face into a grazing patch." The crowd parted. A tall man stepped out from the shadows of the eaves. Silas Thorne. He wore a dusty duster coat, his Stetson pulled low to shadow a face covered in dark, heavy stubble. His eyes were as gray and murky as storm clouds, cold and devoid of any mercy. Silas didn't even look at Barney. He just stared at Clara as if he were appraising a piece of dry goods or a sturdy pack horse. Barney grumbled a curse, but when he caught a glimpse of the Colt revolver peeking from Silas' hip, he tucked tail and cleared out. Silas approached Clara, his breath heavy with tobacco and the scent of the trail. "I heard you're lettered, know your ciphers, and know how to keep your mouth shut when it counts," Silas said, his voice as gravelly as a rock slide. "I got a spread out at Wolf Ridge. Nothing there but burnt grass, hungry wolves, and 4 kids living like wild animals since their mother passed. I don't need a trophy wife. I need a woman tough enough not to curl up and die during the first winter. You got the brains, I got the muscle. You in?" He pulled out a rusty brass key and pressed it into her cold palm. There was no romantic proposal, only a survival pact between 2 outcasts. I can't give you an heir," Clara whispered, her throat tight with bitterness. Silas gave a cold grunt. "I got 4 mouths to feed already. I need a mind to manage that mess, not another belly. Make up your mind, the last wagon pulls out at sundown." Clara gripped the key tight. Here, she was an ill omen. At Wolf Ridge, at least she'd be a useful soul. She nodded. The journey up the mountain lasted 2 grueling days. When the wagon creaked to a halt before the gates of Wolf Ridge, Clara's heart sank. It was a line of grey log cabins perched precariously on a cliffside, surrounded by pitch-black pine forests. The wind howled through the rock crevices like the wails of lost souls. But it wasn't the scenery that made her shiver, it was the people. Standing on the stone steps was a young girl about 17. She wore leather chaps, a gun belt, and the man's battered hat. Her frayed blonde hair was pulled into a messy bun. This was Elias, the eldest child Silas had mentioned with a mix of pride and helplessness. "Pa brought home a China doll from Boston, did he?" Elias called out, her voice dripping with sharp sarcasm. The girl stepped closer, circling Clara like a wolf stalking prey. "Look at these hams, Pa. They're Verticlan ivories, not milking cows or chopping wood. That scar on her back is probably the devil's mark for all we know." "Shut your trap, Elias," Silas snapped, tossing the luggage to the ground. "Clara's the housekeeper now. You'll do as she says." Elias didn't answer her father. She leaned in close to Clara's face, her breath puffing white in the mountain chill. "Get this straight, lady. My mother's buried under that cedar tree over yonder. You might sleep in her bed, but don't you think for a second you're stepping into anyone's heart in this house. Wilfridge don't need no music teacher. It needs someone who can handle a piece." With that, Elias drew the revolver from her hip, fired a shot into the air that sent the mountain bird scattering, and spat on the ground, before spurring her horse toward the deep woods. Clara stood silent in the echo of the shot, the cold beginning to seep through her thin coat. Silas sighed, his rough hand briefly brushing her shoulder in a rare gesture of comfort. "Pay her no mind. She's just a wild filly that ain't been broken yet." Clara watched as Elias' silhouette vanished into the thick fog of the mountain range, leaving behind a bone-chilling silence, broken only by the wind whistling through the crevices of the Wolf Ridge cliffs. Clara took a deep breath, the freezing air piercing her lungs like 1,000 needles. She reached out to pick up her threadbare valise and stepped over the rotting wooden threshold into the place Silas called home. Inside, the stench of burnt tallow mixed with the rank smell of raw hides hit her full force. The light from the oil lamp in Silas's hand flickered, casting long, twisted shadows against the soot-stained timber walls. The 3 younger children, the oldest maybe 10, the youngest barely 4, were huddled behind a long wooden table scarred by knife marks. They watched Clara with wary eyes. There were no welcoming smiles here, only the feral stare of young guns who had lost their mother. "Your room's over yonder," Silas said, pointing to a small door tucked near the kitchen corner, his voice raspy with exhaustion from the long hall. "The kids sleep across the way. Don't mind, Elias. She'll be back once she's blown off some steam. Now get some shut-eye. Come morning, the chores won't wait for nobody." Clara's room was little more than a partitioned-off pantry. Inside stood a rusty iron bed with a dry straw mattress and a battered wooden trunk. As Clara lay down, the straw crunched beneath her, and she felt the scar on her back throb with a sharp ache. She didn't sleep that night. She heard heavy boots thudding on the floorboards in the hallway. Elias was back. Then came the muffled sound of an argument between Silas and his eldest daughter, ending with a slam that shook the table. The next morning, Clara wasn't woken by a rooster's crow, but by a bucket of ice-cold water dumped straight into the wool boots she'd left by the bed. She bolted up to find Elias standing in the doorway, empty bucket in hand, her face devoid of any remorse. "Rise and shine, old schoolma'am," Elias sneered, her eyes as sharp as a bowie knife. "Up at Wolf Ridge, if you don't work, you don't get warm boots. You want to be the housekeeper? Then get your tail out to the barn and get started. The milk cow's waiting for you to give her a lesson." Clara remained silent. She dried her boots with an old rag, pinned up her hair, and stepped outside. For the next week, Elias made Clara's life a living hell on the prairie. The girl swapped the salt crock for fine sand, turning the soup Clara had labored over into a gritty disaster. At midnight, Elias stealthily unlatched the corral gate, letting the bay horse Clara's only memento bolt into the deep woods. As Clara ran frantically through the pitch-black night looking for the horse, she heard Elias' cold laughter echoing from the barn. "Go on back to Boston and play your piano. There's no room here for crybabies." The hostility peeped when Elias caught Clara trying to teach the 2 younger ones their letters by tracing them in the thick dust on the table. Elias lunged forward, grabbing a handful of black mud and hurling it onto the unfinished alphabet. "Don't go filling their heads with that hickory dock trash." Elias screamed, her hand dropping to the grip of her pistol. "Letters won't help us pick off a wolfback, and they won't keep this spread from cattle rustlers. You're just trying to turn 'em soft, just like you." Clara stood up, facing down the young girl's potential gun barrel. "Strength isn't just about the finger on the trigger, Elias. It's about knowing what you're protecting. You're trying to run me off because you're scared that if this house gets warm, you'll forget the cold of the day your mother left. Ain't that right?" Elias's face went pale as she went to swing a slap at Clara, but Silas's sudden appearance in the doorway cut her short. His face was etched with the lines of a hard-scrabble life. "That's enough. Elias, get to the stables. Clara, come with me. We need to check the herd in the North Valley before the snow hits." There was a fateful trip. While the 2 women were locked in their psychological war, the Wyoming wilderness had prepared a death sentence. A sudden hailstorm slammed down while they were halfway up Howling Wolf Ridge. Stones the size of fists fell like buckshot. Silas, trying to shield a stray calf, was struck by a boulder rolling from the heights. The sickening snap of bone echoed through the thunder. His horse reared, throwing him down into the dry creek bed below. "Pa!" Elias shrieked, her voice breaking. She stood frozen at the top of the slope, her hands usually so steady with a gun, now shaking uncontrollably at the sight of her unbeatable father, lying still in a pool of blood. In that moment, Clara, the woman Elias had dismissed as a China doll, took charge. She didn't scream. She lunged down the slippery rocks, tearing her scarf away with her thin hands to bind Silas' spurting wound. "Elias, get your head in the game," Clara bellowed over the howling storm. "If you don't get down here and hold this litter steady, your father's going to bleed out before sundown. Get down here now." For the first time, Elias felt small before the scarred woman. She slid down, her eyes blurred with tears and rain, and began to work with Clara on a white-knuckle rescue in the heart of the wild. Silas Thorne's groans were swallowed by the howling blizzard as the two women hauled him over the threshold. The kitchen floorboards let out a heavy thud as the cowboy's massive frame collapsed. Blood soaked through his pant leg, mixing with rainwater and slush into a pale pink smear across the dust. "Pa! Oh, Pa!" Elias shrieked, her hands, which never flinched on a trigger, now fumbling uselessly over Silas' chest. She dropped to her knees, face white as a sheet, breath coming in ragged gasps like a cornered critter. "Move it, Elias. Don't you dare shake him," Clara snapped, her voice turning to steel with an authority that stunned the girl. Without waiting for a reaction, Clara snatched the Bowie knife from Silas' belt and made a clean, decisive slice through the waterlogged leather clinging to his leg. The sight beneath made Elias gag. Silas' shin bone had punched through the meat, jagged and bone-white under the flickering oil lamp. Blood pulsed out with every weak beat of his heart. "Boiling water. Now," Clara barked, her thin hands clamping down on Silas's femoral artery to plug the leak. "Get the strongest bottle of bourbon in the cupboard. And the cleanest linens we got. Move." Elias stood frozen for a heartbeat, staring at Clara's blood-stained hands. She'd never seen this China doll act with such grit, but Clara's piercing glare chased away any doubt. Elias bolted into the kitchen, her boots drumming on the wood like a war dance. While waiting for the water, Clara used a strip of cloth torn from her petticoat to tie a tourniquet above the wound. She gritted her teeth, sweat breaking on her brow despite the room being bone-chilling. Memories of the fire flooded back, the screams, the smell of charred flesh, and the army surgeons who'd snatched her back from the Grim Reaper. She was repeating those same motions now, cold and clinical. "Here's the hooch," Elias panted, rushing back with a jug of moonshine. "Pour it on the wound. This is going to sting like hell, you. Hold his shoulders down tight." When the stinging liquid hit the open gash, Silas' body bucked violently. He let out a gut-wrenching roar before passing out cold. Elias sobbed, but Clara kept a face that was terrifyingly calm. She rinsed the wound with whiskey. Then, with a sharp jerk she'd learned from the bone setters in Boston, she slammed the break back into place. A sickening crunch echoed through the quiet room. Elias felt as if her own bones had just shattered. The next 10 days at Wolf Ridge were a war of attrition. Silas lay in a fever dream, his skin burning as he rambled, calling out for his late wife. Clara barely slept. She turned the kitchen into a field hospital, alternating between boiling pine needles for antiseptic and brewing thin broth from the last bits of jerky. Elias stopped her hell-raising. She sat grimly on the porch, Winchester across her knees, her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep as she watched for the wolves starting to catch the scent of blood around the spread. But the real enemy didn't have fur. One gray morning, with snow drifted halfway up the first-floor windows, Elias burst inside, her breath coming out in white plumes. "It's gone. Clara." Supply shed number 2, the Blackwoods torched it. Clara stiffened, mid-pour with a bowl of medicine. "What we got left?" "Nothing." They burnt the hay and the salt meat to a cinder. "They want us on our knees begging for scraps or starving to death so they can rustle the herd." Elias slammed her fist against the timber, tears of pure helplessness welling up. I'm going after 'em. I'm gonna kill every last one of those vultures. Where do you think you're going in this whiteout? Clara set the bowl down and stepped closer. That's exactly what they want. You leave. Silas is defenseless, and Toby. A hacking cough from the small room of the youngest little Toby cut her off. The 4-year-old began to shake with a seizure, his chest heaving with every labored breath. Pneumonia. The cold and the lack of supplies were beginning to reap the weak. Elias snapped. She grabbed her bearskin coat and thumbed rounds into her 6-shooter. I'm ridden to town for a dock. Get out of my way. You'll be a corpse before you clear the valley. Clara blocked the door, her deep blue eyes burning with a strange, fierce resolve. What the hell do you know? Elias screamed, her trembling barrel pointed right at Clara's chest. You got no family, no kin. You're just a piece of driftwood that washed up here. You want to watch my brother die, just like you watched your folks burn, don't you? A deathly silence fell over the room. Clara didn't flinch. She reached up slowly and began unbuttoning her frayed wool sweater. Fumbling, Elias lowered her iron, watching the woman in bewilderment. Clara turned her back and let the thin garment drop. Under the dim lamplight, Elias saw a web of scars, twisted, angry, and red like gnarled roots crawling across Clara's back. It was the wreckage of a literal hell. I crawled over the bodies of my mother and father to drag my siblings out of that rubble, Elias. Clara's voice whispered, cold enough to freeze marrow. I've lived with this pain for 3 years, just to earn one more day. Don't you ever tell me I don't know what it means to protect a family. My womb might be empty, but my heart has died and come back enough times to know that your temper right now is the devil's right hand. Elias dropped her gun. She crumpled to the floor, burying her face in her hands and sobbing. Every bit of her tough-as-nails cowboy act shattered against Clara's raw agony. Clara pulled her clothes back on, stepped over, and rested a hand on Elias's messy hair. Listen to me. Toby needs heat and pine lard mash. I'll sit with him. As for you, Elias, you're the eyes of this house. The black winds are coming back when the snow lets up. You've got to be the one to hold the line. Elias looked up, her tear-streaked eyes meeting Clara's with a mix of respect and fear. For the first time, she gave a submissive nod. All right, I'll handle the outside. But you save Toby, please. We're gonna save everyone, Clara said firmly, though she felt her own breath shaking. The following days, Wolf Ridge became a lonely fortress in the wilderness. Clara used every last candle stub to keep Toby's room warm, using the herbal lore her grandmother taught her to force-feed the boy spoons of bitter pine sap. Elias was a different creature now. She was a silent shadow, flickering between the stables and the fence line, a rifle ready to drop any shadow lurking near the main house. The bond between them began to sprout from the ashes of the storehouse. Every night once Toby was settled, Elias would quietly bring Clara a scrap of hardtack or some warm water. They didn't say much, but the way Elias discreetly placed the silver harmonica, a keepsake she'd once planned to toss back on Clara's table, spoke volumes. Silas' health began to turn a corner, but that was also when the blizzard started to fall. The moment Buck Blackwood's piercing whistle cut out, the silence of Wolf Ridge was ripped apart by the frantic thud of hooves pounding against the thin, melting snow. Clara let go of the door handle, her blue eyes narrowing as she peered through a gap in the wooden windbreak. Dark silhouettes on horseback were lining up at the edge of the pine forest, rifles resting across their saddles, waiting for a surrender that was never going to come. Inside the bedroom, a loud crash echoed. Silas Thorne, his face a sickly gray from the agony, was using his massive, muscled arms to heave his heavy frame out of bed. His left leg was still bound in splints, but he'd snatched the Winchester rifle propped by the headboard, using it like a crutch to steady himself against the floorboards. "Stand by me, Clara. Hand me that ammo pouch." Silas growled, sweat pouring off his forehead in buckets. He spat through gritted teeth, the veins in his jaw bulging like corded steel as he took one staggering, limping step after another toward the window. "You're out of your mind, Silas." You'll rip those stitches right open." Clara lunged toward him, trying to press him back down, but Silas brushed her aside with his good arm. His eyes burned with the wild fire of a cornered mountain lion. "I ain't laying here like a rotting log while my daughter faces those sumbitches alone," Silas bellowed, his voice raspy but commanding. He leaned his back against the window frame, the black muzzle of his rifle poking out, aimed dead set at Buck Blackwood. "Wake up, Elias. Plug any man that sets foot over that fence." Hearing her father's voice, Elias's spirit caught fire. She hunkered down behind the stable fence, glancing at the pine branches marking the spots where Clara had secretly laid snares 3 days prior. Back then, she thought her ma was being overcautious, setting bear traps to ward off timber wolves, but now she saw that Clara had read the play perfectly. Buck Blackwood spurred his horse forward, letting out a guttural laugh when he saw Silas's barrel peeking through the window. "Silas, you still got the strength to hold a peace. Don't make your woman and kin suffer. No more hand over the herd." Crack! The round from Silas's rifle grazed the brim of Buck's hat, making the man jerk his reins back in a panic. "Take one more step, and I'll put a lead pill right between your eyes," Silas roared, his chest heaving violently from the pain. Buck's face turned sour. He signaled 3 of his goons to circle around the back of the cow barn, right onto the trail where Clara had hidden the traps. "Flush out the cattle. Anyone gets in the way, drop 'em." The 3 outlaws hammered their horses down the snowy path. They felt like they'd won, seeing no one guarding the rear. But suddenly, snap, crunch. The sound of clashing steel rang out over the horrific screams of horses. The lead mare buckled as a bear trap crushed her hoof to splinters. The 2 riders behind them hit a blind panic as their mounts stepped into the next set of traps, which Clara had calculated with the precision of a Pro Bowl player. Chaos exploded. Buck's hardened gunmen went flying into the snow, their legs clamped tight in the steel teeth. "Now, Elias, light 'em up!" Clara screamed from the porch. Elias squeezed the trigger, hitting the kerosene cans placed right next to the traps. Fire roared to life, burning bright against the white snow. A wall of flame shot up, cutting the gang in 2. From the window, Silas kept up the covering fire, his shots, whether seated or standing, keeping the Blackwoods' heads pinned to the dirt. Buck Blackwood stood frozen. He watched his tough-as-leather men wailing over the invisible traps hidden beneath the pristine snow. He looked at Clara, the woman standing tall amidst the smoke and fire, then up at Silas, the dying cowboy, who was still willing to go down swinging to protect his home. "You lost, Buck," Silas bellowed, his voice echoing through the high timber. Elias vaulted down from the stable window, leveling her rifle straight at Buck's chest. "Get the hell out of here right now, or I'll let you taste the last trap my ma set with her own 2 hands." The gang turned tail in total disgrace, leaving Buck trembling as he stared at the iron fortress the Thorne family had built. As the last shadow vanished, Silas let his rifle drop and collapsed into the arms of Clara, who had rushed over to catch him. Elias ran back, grabbing Clara's grease-stained, rust-covered hands, then looked at her father, who was gasping for air from pure exhaustion. "We won! Pa, Ma! We actually did it." Clara smiled a look of relief, but one backed by pure, unshakable grit. However, as the rush of victory faded, a sudden, strange wave of nausea washed over Clara, forcing her to grip Silas' arm to stay upright. Silas' arm felt as solid as a boulder, and the warmth radiating from his tweed jacket helped steady the fluttering in her chest. She took a deep breath. The acrid stench of gunpowder mingled with the scent of melting snow, creating a heavy, thick air. Buck Blackwood and his remaining varmints had vanished behind the pines, leaving nothing but dark blood spatters on the white crust and the rusted bear traps that had finally served their purpose. "Get me inside, Clara, my leg. It ain't listening to me no more," Silas wheezed, his face shifting from a feverish flush to a terrifying ghostly pale. Elias quickly moved to his other side, helping Clara hoist Silas back onto the wooden bed in the lean-to. The wound on his leg had split wide open, blood seeping through the bandages Clara had meticulously wrapped days prior. But this time, as Clara set to work cleaning the gash, Elias didn't stand by with doubt or spit. She quietly set water to boil, prepped fresh linens, and even brewed a cup of warm herbal tea, placing it by Clara's side. "Take a breather, Ma. I'll keep watch over Pa," Elias said softly. The name slipped out as natural as if it had always been there, just waiting for the storm to break so it could show its face. Clara nodded, but as she stood, a violent bout of vertigo sent the room spinning. She white-knuckled the bed frame to keep from biting the dust. Silas narrowed his grey, clouded eyes at her, his face etched with worry. "You're running on empty, Clara. Since you set foot on the spread, you ain't had a lick of rest. Don't let this ranch run you dry before spring even hits." Clara only offered a weak smile, telling herself it was just the exhaustion from the long nights tending to Silas and Toby, piled on top of the sheer terror of the standoff. She stepped out onto the porch, watching the frail March sun try to pierce the overcast sky. Down in the valley, the snow was beginning to sink, revealing patches of dark brown earth, the promise of new grass. April arrived, bringing a miraculous change to Wolf Ridge. The pine forests no longer groaned under the weight of the ice, but began to rustle in the Chinook winds. Silas was back on his feet, hobbling around the yard with a cane. Though his gait was hitched, his iron-fisted authority as ranch boss had returned. The herd was being driven down to the low meadows, where the first green shoots were peeking out after their long sleep. However, Clara's health didn't bloom with the season. On the contrary, she became strangely sensitive. The smell of frying bacon, a staple she'd always loved, now turned her stomach so fiercely she had to bolt for the garden. The warm family meals that were once her pride became a trial. She could hardly choke down anything but water and a few scraps of hardtack. "You sure you won't tail?" Silas asked one afternoon, seeing Clara sitting listlessly on the porch, her usually rosy cheeks gone sallow. "Or is it that old sickness from back east? Acting up again?" Clara shuddered. Elias' greatest fear, the ghost of the fire, and the judgment of those Boston doctors came haunting back. "I don't know, Silas. I feel like my body don't belong to me no more. Maybe I just ain't built for this high country weather like I thought." Silas didn't say another word. He packed their gear and hitched the two strongest horses to a buckboard lined with soft quilts. He knew that in Cheyenne, a day's ride away, there was a doctor named Henry, a man newly arrived from New York with the latest medical savvy. The journey down the mountain was a tense, quiet affair. Elias sat in the back, gripping Clara's hand as if trying to pour her own strength into her. The girl had seen too many frontier women pass over from sudden sickness, and she couldn't stomach the thought of losing a second mother, just as she'd found her. Dr. Henry's office was small but shipshape, tucked behind the town's land records building. Clara sat on the wooden chair, her heart hammering like a trapped bird as the old doctor began his exam. Silas stood leaned against the doorframe, his massive hand crushing his Stetson, his eyes never leaving his wife's face. After a thorough checkup, Doctor Henry lowered his spectacles and looked at Clara with a peculiar smile. "Mrs. Montgomery, who told you that you couldn't carry a child?" Clara was floored. 3 years ago, the doctors in Boston, they said the high fever and the injuries from the fire ruined everything. "They told me my womb was dead, Doctor." The old man let out a soft, kindly chuckle. "Well, ma'am, Eastern medicine gets a bit too tangled up in their textbook sometimes. They forget the human body has a miraculous way of mending itself when it's fed on peace and a whole lot of love. You aren't sick, that nausea, that bone-dead tired. Those are the signs of a new seed taking root. You're going on 4 months along." Clara felt a jolt shoot down her spine like lightning. She looked at the doctor, then at Silas. Silas stood as still as a stone monument, his hat slipping from his hand and hitting the floor unheeded. Carrying a babe?" Silas croaked, his voice trembling like a young greenhorn. "You sure, Doc?" She was scorched by the flames. Fire might scar the hide, but it can't stop the will of the Almighty, Mr. Thorne, Dr. Henry affirmed. It was the clean air, the fresh victuals, and the peace of finding a real home at Wolf Ridge that woke this miracle up. My congratulations to you both. On the ride back to the ranch, the sunset bathed the valley in a deep purple and brilliant gold. Silas held the reins, but his eyes kept drifting back to Clara. He pulled the wagon over in the middle of a field of budding wildflowers. Without a word, he stepped down and swept Clara up in his arms. He knelt in the grass, pressing his ear to her thick wool coat, listening for a sound he'd never dared hope to hear again. Clara stroked her husband's coarse hair, tears streaming down her face. She realized then the karma wasn't just about the wicked getting their just desserts like Buck Blackwood. It was about the good being made whole. Her sacrifice for the thorns, her bravery in the blizzard, her wheats in defending the spread. It had all paved the way for this miracle. The summer of 1881 was the brightest in the history of Wolf Ridge. The pines seemed greener, and the cattle were fatter than anyone could remember. Elias never left Clara's side, handcrafting a cradle from the finest, most fragrant cedar planks. All of Silas' skin from the stoic bow to little Toby waited with bated breath for the new arrival. One late autumn night, as the first flakes of the season began to drift down, a lusty cry echoed through the main house. A healthy baby boy with Silas' gray eyes and Clara's sharp brow was born. They named him Thomas, after Clara's late father. Silas sat by the bed, his rough hand gently touching the tiny hand of the babe. He looked at Clara, a woman who looked more radiant and powerful than any queen. You brought life back to this land, Clara. Not just for me or the kids, but for the whole Thorn line. Clara gave a serene, satisfied smile. She looked out the window where the Montgomery Ranch, that they had officially changed the name to honor her, stood tall against the wilderness. She was no longer a failed music teacher with shameful scars. She was a mother to 6, the mistress of the mountain, and the living proof that love can turn the harshest badlands into a Garden of Eden. The scars on Clara's back remained, but they were no longer the marks of hell. They were the map of how she'd found her way home.